We have wonderful speakers tonight. We will introduce them after the movie. We are starting to look at a movie which will be the basis for our discussion. So here it is. Okay.
Quieto. ¿Sí? Ah, ¿sí?
Well, hello again. I would like immediately to introduce you to our speakers tonight. On my right, rather on my left, is Radhika Kuramaswamy. She is the Special Representative of the Secretary General and Under Secretary General at the United Nations on Children and Armed Conflict. And as you can see, it's not only about child soldiers. She is a lawyer. She's a strong advocate of women's rights. She has been the chairperson of the Sri Lanka Human Rights Commission. She has written books, many articles on constitutional law and other things. She's one of us. She's also from Columbia and Yale. She has innumerable degrees and awards, so I will stop there for fear of embarrassing her. It's an honor to have you tonight, Radhika. She's a friend. She was recruited by the Secretary General Kofi Annan, I believe in 2006, but she was recruited again by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in 2007, the year after when Kofi Annan left. She has done extraordinary work at the UN on this issue, and we are going to make her talk about it. Thank you for coming, Radhika. On my right, and there is a slight change. I want to tell you that today is the day of Syria at the Security Council. There is a big meeting. I'm sure you read it in the news that Hillary Clinton is there. And therefore, the ambassador of Germany, Germany is in the council just now as an E10, an elected 10, could not come tonight because Syria has precedents. I don't know if they will pass a resolution tonight, but apparently they will continue discussing all this tomorrow. And perhaps pass the resolution in any way. The ambassador was gracious enough to send us his political officer, Ralph Schroer, who is really the person who at the German mission has been working on this. So in a way, he knows much more than the ambassador on this, and we are welcoming him at SIPA. Close to Ralph is Grace Okalo. And Grace Okalo was a child soldier herself in Uganda. She was taken by the LRA. Tonight, she really represents the people of the world. She represents what we are all about at the UN. This is it. And as a matter of fact, we will start with her tonight. She will tell you her story. She will tell you what this is all about. And last but not least is Joe Becker, who is with Human Rights Watch, who is an old friend, who has come to SIPA, who teaches here as well, who represents the NGOs. I always tell students there are 4 United Nations, the United Nations of the member states. Here is one. The member states of the Secretary General, with the special representative of the Secretary General, the member states of the NGOs, of the private sector, of the press. They are very important players with us. And then they are the people of the world for which this organization exists. So I want to turn to Grace immediately. Grace, thank you for coming. Grace has written books about her life. She has also started a foundation. She is the director and of this foundation for the rights of African women and children. Grace, you saw this movie. And was I correct in understanding that this car at the end is the United Nations? It's not a very good picture of the United Nations. So tell me, first of all, tell us your story. And tell us, is this what the UN is doing regarding this issue? We give you the floor.
The van at the end of the movie is just, maybe they wanted to make people laugh or something like that, but what I have seen the UN actually done in Uganda is not giving candy as that, because the situation is intense that even if you're inhuman, you cannot just give candy and walk away like that. I don't know who the director of the documentary or the movie is, or who wrote it. Maybe they just wanted to eliminate too much of tension. You see, at the beginning of the movie is all intense, and maybe just to make it a little bit more. The situation, as you saw in the movie, the suffering that children go through. This is just a little bit of it, showing a little bit of what children go through. But it's worse than that. It's worse than what you just saw. I use it. I call it actually. It's worse than death itself, because you actually pray for death, and death does not come. I mean, and if it doesn't come, you actually try to kill yourself. And I tried to do that several times. I was in high school in Uganda, and my first year in high school, when the Lord's Resistance Army and I'm sure you've heard of them because you're international affairs students. You must have read something. But the Lord's Resistance Army are the rebel from Uganda, northern Uganda, who have devastated northern Uganda, Sudan, Congo, and the Republic of Africa. And he's still existing up to today. And what the Lord's Resistance Army does is to abduct children, even at the age of 6, and taking them and training them. It's not a training of, real training of soldiers. It's really suffering because the children are beaten. The children are initiated into the group by beating. The children are threatened by witchcraft, which the LRA leader makes the children believe. And then the children are made to kill after they have been beaten and forced to look when they were killing. You're forced to kill. And then you're given a AK-47 now to go fight. And the fighting is not really fighting. They're sending you to kill the civilians. And I was taken from Uganda to Sudan, and we were sent to fight the SPLA, the Sudan People's Liberation Army, now known here the Lost Boys of Sudan. We were sent to fight them. We were sent to loot their food. We were sent to destroy these people. But it's not that the child has to go free. And there's this well-known word called kill or be killed. It's a survival. It's a way of survival. If you don't kill, you're killed. If you don't loot, you don't eat. You have to loot to take the food to the commanders. Sometimes you get that food, you don't eat it. If you don't get it, you're killed or you're beaten really properly. It's not just a little stick that is put on your butt, but a real beating that sometimes you lose your conscience to think you're gone. It is very hard for the children who are in the army. And imagine an adult. If an adult was to go through that, and imagine yourself, if a child of 6 years old, a child of 7 years old, a child of 12 going through this kind of pain, it is unbearable. And that child thinking of killing themselves, that child thinking of, it is a pain that is hard to understand until actually you see it or you face it. And then sometimes when these children are taken, before they're taken, they're forced to kill their own parents. You saw the children in the movie, they're alone, they're now adults. There are two ways to interpret that. Either the parents were killed by the rebels or the soldiers, or they were forced to kill their own parents, and now they're coming back to a place with no adults, no people to take care of them, or they have been rejected and they're trying to survive on their own, because these children also are rejected by the community because of the atrocities they're forced to commit.
Thank you, Grace, for sharing with us. You know, there are 2 million children all over the world who are subject to this. There are more than 5 million of them, 2 million who have been dead and died, killed. There are more than 5 million of them who have been maimed, who have had no life, no education, no childhood. It's all over the globe. It's not only Africa, it's everywhere. So the issue here is, what has the United Nations done? In the past decade, the Council has become increasingly engaged in this. And I think you as students very often think of the Security Council as a political organ, and you're absolutely right, it is a political organ. But you don't think of its human rights agenda always. And I really believe that it started with Graça Machel and the General Assembly, who wanted to have a report on this. And then it ended up with the the establishment of a special representative for the Secretary General, a number of resolutions that I will ask my colleagues to explain, because the normative framework has been such an incredible story in the Security Council. The question is really, has it worked? Has it made any difference for the children who are caught into this conflict? What has worked? What has not worked? The Council has invented a lot of new tools, like shaming and blaming and punishing and reporting and monitoring and all this. Is that a tool that can be used for other issues like women and rape of women, for instance? This is the discussion I'd like to have. What difference does it make on the ground for the NGOs? Have they seen a difference with those resolutions? Is there a gap between the normative framework, the legal frameworks which have been invented, and the implementation of this? So maybe I should turn to you, Radhika. If you could take us through that story.
Try. Well, let me say that I used to be special rapporteur on violence against women in the 1990s, and I remember that the Security Council would not even deal with the human rights issue. In fact, Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland, who was the High Commissioner, would never address the Security Council. They would not let her anywhere near. And I remember, just because violence against women was an issue that many member states had, they only let me address them in an ARIA formula, which is in this thing. So the Council was very allergic to human rights issues through the 80s and very much into the 90s. The first issue on which they began to react was this issue, children in armed conflict. Graça Machel, as you know, the wife of Nelson Mandela, was asked by the General Assembly first to write a report on children in armed conflict based on what was happening mainly in Liberia and Sierra Leone. And then she wrote this report, suggested the creation of an Undersecretary General post, and also suggested that it come before the Council. But I must say we must really give credit to my predecessor, Olara Otuno, who was the former ambassador of Uganda in the United Nations, who had this vision that Security Council can do something on this issue. And it was really his vision that we are now truly trying to implement. And I think what's important is that the Council does not deal with this as a human rights issue. They're very clear, this is a peace and security issue. So that's why we get Russia and China on board, because they don't like human rights issues really, though it's changing, dealt with the Council. And basically the first thing that the Council, first thing that Olara, my predecessor, did was to get the Council, and I must say, he didn't act alone. The NGOs were strongly behind him, as was UNICEF, and it was really a major pincer effort at the Council. And led by countries like France, for example, and Benin. This was how this issue went forward. And the first thing was to get an annual report every year on children in armed conflict. And over the few years, it became an unusual annual report because it just didn't deal with general themes. It began to deal with grave violations against children, what we call the 6 grave violations: the killing and maiming of children, sexual violence against children, the recruitment and use of children as child soldiers, the denial of humanitarian access, attacks on schools and hospitals, and abductions. Now, these 6 grave violations were monitored in situations of conflict, and monitored by looking at perpetrators and incidents, so mentioned them by name. So that became a new kind of report, because mainly reports to the Council were more thematic. So this was actually identifying perpetrators and incidents. Then we moved on. The Council really was horrified by this phenomenon of child soldiers that Grace mentioned to you. And so the Council asked the Secretary General to provide every year a list of parties that recruit and use children. That means actually naming parties. And the purpose of that was at some time that there would be a targeted sanctions against these parties if it continues, and they're on this list for a long time. And then in 2005, they went further, that they created a monitoring and reporting mechanism in the countries on conflict, so that the whole UN country team, led by the resident coordinator and this RSG would form a task force on children in armed conflict and collect information to be sent through to the special representative. And they also created a working group on children in armed conflict. And finally, the next step was in 2009 and then just July, was to expand the triggers, not only recruitment and use of child soldiers, but also sexual violence, name the parties, killing and maiming, and attacks on schools and hospitals was passed in July. So basically a gradual process of naming and shaming parties with the possibility of sanctions at a future date. They have imposed sanctions on parties in the DRC and Cote d'Ivoire and the sanctions committees of Somalia, but still there's not much. Some of the member states are a little reluctant to go to sanctions in a big way, but still the shaming is there. And just, I don't want to talk too long, but I go to the field along with my UNICEF and other colleagues with this list of shame, and we talk to the parties who are on this list, whom we can have access to. And you don't realize how important it is for them to get off this list, because many of them have hopes of becoming leaders of their countries and becoming future leaders, and they will then enter into an action plan with us and to release children. We negotiate those action plans and they're released to UNICEF, and UNICEF takes care of their reintegration. This is now developed over the years. There are, of course, some parties who will not negotiate. Lord's Resistance Army, maybe Taliban or Al-Shabaab, but a lot of them do. And we have out of 61 persistent violators, over the last 2 years, we've managed to have 15 signed action plans. Now at the moment, there are about 6 being negotiated. So there is movement. We estimate that over the year 2010, for example, UNICEF estimates that 11,000 children were released. So there is practical results on the ground as a result of this process, and it's the deterrent value of the Council, especially when I met the President of Chad. He said, I have to get off this list. I don't want to be on any Security Council list. Just tell me how. The UPDF, which is the Ugandan army, was on the list. Within 2 years, they cleared out their children and became a very professional force, mainly because they were on this list and wanted to get out. So there have been targeted results as a result of the Security Council engagement. Interesting. And it is interesting when you think that the Council was a place that would not entertain human rights before, that it has a working group, a monitoring system. So I think the issue of children in armed conflict is an innovative experiment of the Council, something we have to watch over the years to see where it goes. So.
Thank you very much, Radhika. It brings a lot of questions in my mind that I perhaps would like to ask Ralph. First of all, why is the Council so reticent in talking about human rights? Because we understand that the Council cannot say that there is a working group on human rights. And this is the only working group of the Security Council which exists on the human rights issue. But it doesn't call it that way. It calls peace and security. It's the same thing if you look at the resolution on Libya. You are not going to see the responsibility to protect very much mentioned. You are going to see protection of civilians. So what is it, Ralph, which is so sensitive in the Council in calling this human rights?
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you for having me, first of all. And I think before I start, I just have to say a word on my ambassador, who would really love to be here tonight, but he can't. So he had sent me, and I'm, of course, just a poor replacement, but I'll try the best. He would really have liked to be here. He was looking forward to it, but there's a perfect storm. He cannot go away. Anyway.
I hope he passed the resolution.
Well, I hope so, too, but I think they were still on it when I left, so this is quite an important moment. I think the answers have been to your question have been already mentioned here and there. This is the Working Group of Security Council is dealing with the humanitarian law. We are not a human rights body as such. We're not the Third Committee or the Human Rights Council. If we look at human rights issue and the rights of children, we're not going. We're not based on a rights-based approach. We look at what does the the situation, what does the violation of children's rights has as a consequence on peace and security. That's why it is on the agenda of Security Council, peace and security. So that's the important point we have to make. And I think the reluctance you mentioned is the cloud of Security Council and the reluctance of some partners, of some member states perhaps, to see perhaps themselves treated by the Security Council in the future. And also, if you look at situations, we're talking about particular conflicts here. We're not talking about international conflict between states, where it is fairly easy to apply humanitarian law. We usually look at asymmetrical conflicts. That means we're looking at conflicts where you have armed groups, illegal rebels, terrorists, guerrillas, whatever you call them, and you have government forces. And if you, say, for example, have a working group of Security Council, which says to country X, very interesting, I want to go to see your country, this action plan, very interesting, I sent the SRSG, and they will talk to your rebel movement. Not everybody is very happy about that. They fear that the insurgents may be internationally, may gain weight, and that they may use this as a way of getting more clout, perhaps. That's one thing. And the other thing is, protection of civilians is a very powerful tool if you think about it. I mean, if you think about Syria, protection of civilians is basically the core of what the UN is supposed to do in peacekeeping missions. And this mechanism, I think you mentioned it, is in a certain way unique because it is a nucleus of a compliance and accountability mechanism. And if you have all the elements there, you have a reporting mechanism, you have an SRSG, you have a working group, you have the possibility of sanctions. That's potentially pretty powerful, and some people are very careful when they allow the working group or the Security Council to go ahead in this field, and it's a very incremental process, taking years after years, and every little building block after the other. And well, it's an ongoing struggle. Sometimes you slide back, sometimes the international, how shall I put it, the atmosphere for protection of civilian issues is more propice. At the beginning of the 90s, it was probably easier than today. Sometimes you have something like a, well, not a cold war, but sometimes fronts are pretty hardened. And in this particular, it's a political body, in this particular field, we try to do our work and convince people that, or convince countries that they should be reticent, but not on this issue, because it's basically not a political issue. It's about children and the situation and the violations they suffer in situations of armed conflict. That should unite us all.
You have been to the Security Council. You have addressed the Security Council. I even understand you had an ovation from the Security Council. How do you see this? How do you see what the Council is doing? Do you think it has made a difference for some of the children? Can you talk to us from the recipient of all these things that the Council has been trying to do?
From the point of the children, let me stand as a child right now, but I'm really an adult. Really, if you're a child, to look at all these processes until they reach the resolution, you find it's too late, even for member states to agree on a certain issue or on the issues that affect children in war. It can be too late when the children have really suffered. I remember when the Security Council just sat to talk about Uganda was in 2006, I think. And I was so upset. I was in my room when I saw the newspaper that the Security Council is sitting down to talk about Uganda, the children of Uganda. And I was so upset because it had already gone 18 years. Children had already suffered 18 years. The people in northern Uganda had suffered 18 years. Children who were born in 1980 were already 18 of age, and they'd grown up in that state. And then they're just sitting to discuss and to come up with a solution to address the situation of the children. It looks like it hurts, that's what I would say. But not to say that the Security Council hasn't done anything, really. Mrs. Kumarasamy, Radhika Kumarasamy, the SRSG, has really done a lot with her group and the UNICEF. They've done a lot, and I've seen that in Uganda when the rebels, the children were running from the internally displaced. After running from their homes, they come to internally displaced camps, but the rebels were still following them to those places. So they had to run from there to the cities to be to run away from the rebels. And they were sleeping on the streets. They were sleeping anywhere they could find just for safety. And I remember UNICEF and UN organizations and even some NGOs trying to erect shelters for the children. At least that was immediate. That was what was needed. That was what the Security Council would have even sat there and said, this is the immediate issue that we have to deal with. But they did something. They came in, they helped, and the naming and shaming list. I was there when Uganda was, that day that I was at the Security Council, that Uganda was lifted out of it. And I remember before I went to address the Security Council, they were panicking. They thought I was going to mention them again at the Security Council.
Wow. Council afraid of you.
Well, they're not afraid of me. I can tell you that. But they just didn't want their name to be mentioned at the Security Council. So I remember them trying to convince me to say we are the same, or we are on the same side. That's how powerful naming and shaming can be. So, and I'm glad they removed them from the list, and I'm hopeful that they will stay that way forever, not taking children. But we still need more. The Security Council really, Mr. Ralph, they really need to do more to help the children, because it's not about, if you say that it's not, how do you fix children in an international law? How do you not call it, how do you refuse to acknowledge it as a human rights issue when the children are being affected? How do you justify it, saying that it's not war against countries, it's within the country? How do you justify that when children are suffering, when human beings are suffering? Does it have to be war between countries for the Security Council to get up to do that? And for the security purposes, because they call it peace and security, the war starts from one country and it can go to a next. Look at the example of the LRA. They have not only stayed in Uganda, they've been in Sudan. Al-Bashir was supporting the LRA since 1980, supporting the LRA. And the LRA have gone to Congo. How is that not? How do you justify that by saying that it's not war against between two countries? It has to be really looked at in a very, let me say, humane way, that children doesn't have to be war or between countries to be acknowledged that it's a human rights issue or a security issue, or to be part of international law.
Thank you.
Sorry.
It's an indictment to a certain extent to the UN. But we have heard, Grace, we have heard a member state, the Security Council, we have heard the representative of the Secretary General. Joe, can you tell us, what is have you seen any difference on the ground? The NGOs, who are really, in a way, the partner, right, of the UN on this one, and particularly, of course, UNICEF, EU for advocacy and so on. First of all, do you believe that your views are taken into consideration, either by the Council, of course, by the UN in general, by the Office of the Secretary General? What is your role in this? Do you have a say in the issue, for instance, in the criticism that Grace was saying? Have you seen a difference on the ground, and to what extent are your views taken into account as an NGO by the Council?
Thank you. I got involved in this issue when I joined Human Rights Watch in 1997. And looking back on the changes that have happened since then, when I first got involved, the big thing that was happening was negotiations at the UN around the optional protocol, the UN treaty that now bans the use of children in armed conflict. And we're actually looking forward in a couple of weeks to a pretty big milepost. In 2 weeks, it's the 10th anniversary of this treaty taking effect. But when the negotiations were happening, governments were still defending the use of child soldiers. I remember diplomats getting up during the negotiations and justifying the use of children, you know, for wars of national liberation and for this reason and for that reason. And I think one measure of how far we've come is that nobody defends the use of child soldiers anymore. I mean, it's really universally considered abhorrent. And of course, it's now also recognized for as a war crime when you recruit children under the age of 15. So, you know, and the protocol that was, you know, adopted in 2000 and that took effect 10 years ago, you know, we now have 2/3 of the world's countries that have, you know, signed on and have pledged not to use children under 18 in armed conflict. So, you know, we really have an international consensus that didn't exist a decade ago. So I think that's a real measure of progress. And even governments like the United States has changed their deployment practices. They no longer send 17-year-olds into combat. The UK doesn't. You know, there are 20 countries that have changed their recruitment ages. So, you know, there are a lot of changes. And I think the power of shame and stigma, as the SRSG has pointed out, has really made a big difference. The fact that there are all these, you know, governments and armed groups as well who are so anxious to get off this list and to sign action plans, you know, shows that they don't want to be considered, you know, child recruiters. And, you know, another big change that we've seen is, you know, a few years ago, it was unheard of for, you know, an individual commander to face any penalties for recruiting child soldiers. You know, they, you know, could recruit children and nobody would blink an eye. But now people are going to jail, you know.
ICC.
The ICC, the Special Court for Sierra Leone. I mean, all 8 individuals who have been convicted by the Special Court for Sierra Leone were convicted of using child soldiers. And some of them are now serving prison sentences of over 50 years. You know, any day now we're going to get verdicts for Lubanga, the first case at the International Criminal Court, and the former president of Liberia, Charles Taylor. I have colleagues who have been out in the field and, like in West Africa, have talked with rebel groups and said, you know, you're using child soldiers. Do you want to be like Charles Taylor? Do you want to be standing trial? Do you want to face the prospects of going to prison? And, you know, that's a persuasive argument. Even if the commander thinks, oh, well, I'm not going to actually end up in The Hague, they don't want to be in that group. They don't want to be considered a war criminal for using child soldiers. So I think there really has been, you know, a seismic change in how people think about these abuses and you know, the motivation. Really, the groups that are still using child soldiers are really the pariahs. You know, the Lord's Resistance Army, you know, Al-Shabaab, you know, the FARC in Colombia, some of these groups. So, you know, I feel like there really, you know, in some respects has been, you know, a lot of progress. Part of it has been through what's happened at the UN. You asked about the role of NGOs. You know, certainly we've been part of this. Human Rights Watch published our first report on child soldiers in 1994. We've since published at least 15 such reports. In the next couple of weeks or next few weeks, we have new reports that will come out on violations against children in the conflict in Somalia, based on work that my colleagues did in the field. We have a new report coming out shortly on Yemen and children taking up arms in that conflict and being killed and maimed as a result of what's happened in the last few months. And I think NGOs have a real unique contribution because oftentimes, you know, we can go places where the UN can't. We can gather information that the UN can't. You know, we were collecting information in Yemen when no one else was there. We were in Libya when nobody else was there. And I think, you know, when we go to meet with the SRSG, when we go to meet with the German mission, there's a recognition that we often have, you know, information that's valuable that that no one else has, and are respected for that. On the other hand, though, there are some members within the UN, some member states that are very suspicious of NGOs, who think that we have a political bias, that we have some agenda. And so one of the challenges that we have is that there's still sort of a two-tier system or perception, and sometimes we feel like we're a little bit second class. For example, the monitoring and reporting mechanism that's been set up on children in armed conflict, it's great. It's, you know, funneling regular reports to, you know, the Security Council's working group, but all the information needs to be UN verified. And for Human Rights Watch, one of our great frustrations is that, you know, for years we've documented violations, child recruitment, and attacks on schools in India. But the UN actors in India won't verify our information. And the same in Thailand. And so the parties that are responsible don't get put on the Secretary General's list. And, you know, that's one of the downsides of the system that we have.
Yeah. But, you know, there is something which absolutely puzzles me here. It's the naming and shaming. Mm. If indeed this is one of the tools of the Security Council, that you can name and shame perpetrators of serious violations of human rights, first of all, my first question to you, Radhika, is can you give us an example of success, of real success of your work, what is it, the work plan?
Action plan.
The action plan. Can you explain to us exactly what this action plan is? I think there is one with Afghanistan just now, but I think there was Chad, Philippines, I don't remember which country. I want to understand this. But my question to you is really, why isn't the shaming and blaming then used on the issue of women as well?
It is now.
It is now?
Yeah. But let me just say, with regard to the action plan, that is the term for the agreement the UN comes with non-state actors to release these children. Now, an example of this that has been quite successful has been the one in Nepal. As you know, the Maoists recruited children. And then I think it was in 2009, we went to Nepal, met with the Maoist leaders, and they initially agreed. It took another year for them to sign, but on the 10th they signed. There are 3,000 minors, as they call them, in the cantonments. So then the action plan was entered into. UN geared itself, having 64 trades, UNDP and UNICEF together, to provide for these children in terms of education or trades. There's 64 programs that they could choose from to go into. So they were taken from the cantonments and sent to the village. Now, of course, everything is always not rosy because we continue to get some commanders keep in touch with some of the children, and they don't fully encourage the children to take up our programs. But slowly, this is being overcome. And we hope that, depending on the report we get from Nepal, that the Maoists will be delisted. But there is this issue of some commanders still maintaining a little contact, which a technical team of mine went in December and basically read the riot act to those commanders. But hopefully that will be ended and this can be another chapter. So that, I think, that action plan, which was really a UN system-wide action plan, which was UNDP, UNICEF, as well as ILO, all coming together to provide programs for these children was quite, and UNMISS, of course, was quite a success.
Ralph, are we ready to do the same, the monitoring, the reporting, the working group, the naming, the shaming, the sanctions, and the ICC for the issue of the rape of women?
Well, we certainly try. For the time being, we are not quite there. Naming and shaming there is, but there's no working group, and there's no, well, there is a monitoring mechanism which is called slightly different. very much the women and sexual violence and conflict angle tries to sort of build on what has been achieved, basically, as kind of icebreaker in the children issue. I think you really have to look at this as a kind of a special, unique case. We went as far as we could on this particular children issue because it was a humanitarian, human rights issue where a lot of people could sort of congregate around and we could overcome difficulties. Now they try to copy that in a certain way and use the blueprint for the women, peace and security angle. I think we will get there in the end, but it will be an uphill struggle because, in a certain way, not everybody in the UN is on the same song sheet. That's banal. So the success of the working group on children and armed conflict in a certain way has also woken up, sleeping, whatever, dragons you can call them, or demons, the people who are worried that the success story could sort of be repeated on other fronts as well. And of course, which is also true, you have to be very, very, very careful when you go to the council that your information is triangulated, that it stands up, that it is watertight, that partners ask you where do you get it from. It has to be UN source. And it's probably, I think, objectively more difficult to have this kind of information when you're talking about rape and sexual violence in faraway places in eastern Congo, where very often the UN is strong on the ground but still too thin. They cannot be there, they cannot be everywhere. It's probably objectively more difficult than say, a situation like child recruitment, where you can go to a camp, you can objectively verify this armed group has stopped its practice. Now, on sexual violence, you have, the victim side, and you have the problem: how can you take witnesses in? How can you protect them? Is it ethically? All kinds of problems. But you have the objective problem: how can you prove these things? How can you prove that? And if you say an armed group X has been responsible for atrocious acts somewhere, you have to establish that somebody gave the order. Because in order to sanction somebody, coming back to Security Council, what does sanction mean? I mean, the instrument we're talking about are targeted sanctions. At the beginning, they sanctioned the country. Now, obviously, this has downsides. And then they came up with targeted sanctions, travel bans, asset freeze. Now, for that, you need an individual who gets the travel ban, who is responsible. Now, you have to establish that there has been an armed group, that there has been sexual violence somewhere, and that there has been a command and control structure, and that the gentleman who is somehow responsible for this, or that you know him, and that you can pinpoint him, you can name him, not just shame him, but you can hand him over to the sanction committee and say, this is the guy. That's pretty difficult. I mean, also because individual countries then say, we would take this UN designation immediately over into our national law. And to do so, we must be dead sure that this guy is still alive, that he's there, that he's done the deeds which you say he's done, and that is a very, very technically very complicated process. We will get there, but it will take time.
So the data collection is much more kind of difficult on the issue of women. But Grace, can I ask you, as a child soldier and as a woman, did you feel that there were more difficulties for the women, be it in what you were asked to do as a child soldier, being after that in the rehabilitation of child soldiers, in the reintegration in the community? Did you think that you had double jeopardy being a woman?
Being a woman, sometimes when you think about it, when you're in a war zone, you regret being a woman. You want to be a man because, well, even these days, boys are being raped. But the suffering that women go through, the girls and the women in armed conflict, I wouldn't say it's worse. I would say that. Because let's take, for example, the child soldiers. Girls are trained the same way as boys. They become child soldiers, they're given guns. But on top of that, they're sexually abused. They're forced to become mothers when they're not prepared to. It is very difficult for girls and women. Rape is very real. Even if we say we can't verify it, that we as Ralph said, I'm sorry I'm attacking you today.
Don't attack Germany just now.
No comment.
So even if they say it's not verifiable, but what about the children? Even in the DDR program, they say bring the guns, disarmament. But should we also bring the children and lay them down and show you that these are the things that has happened, or this is the evidence of the atrocities that have been committed against women? I think there should be another way of not just taking, I mean, UN is a complicated system, but I think they should come sooner than later. In the case of Congo now, where you find it's not only men raping, but they're using different instruments to rape women. That is inhuman. That's a human rights abuse. And they say, Ralph mentioned that there is no, it's hard to pinpoint who did that. But in every rebel group, we have a leader. And that leader should be responsible for what is happening to the civilians in the community. And if that leader is not, if such things are happening, he should be brought to justice because he allowed it. He's the one leading this group. If you're president of the country, let's take, for example, America now, whatever is happening is blamed on the president. You have to lead your people to make sure that they do not commit atrocities against people. And if they do that, then you're responsible. You should be judged for it. And if you feel you're not judged, then you bring up people who did that. You know that they did that to the people. And I don't understand why the issue of sexual abuse is hard to actually bring it as a human rights issue, because it's been even stated that it's now used as a weapon of war, even in different countries. Well, it was named in Rwanda, and I went to Rwanda and I couldn't eat because of what I saw, not the dead bodies, but the weapons that were used on women alone. You cannot believe that a human being can do such a thing to another. So the issue of women is very there, but it's downplayed. Even recently, girls in armed conflict or girl child soldiers, and I want to thank Mrs. Kumaraswamy again to bring this issue to the Security Council and even to the ICC. It is being recognized, but it's not enough. These people should be prosecuted of abducting girls, not only for use of as a child soldier, but the abuse that they do for these children become their sexual slaves. They're not wives. They call them child wives, but they're not wives. They're slaves to these people. And what happens if this child comes back? What happens if this girl comes back? The boys come back. They lay down the guns. It's not easy for them to become, integrated. But it's more harder for girls to be integrated because they have the children. They've been affected by HIV/AIDS. They've been every kind of suffering you can imagine. And then they're rejected from their community. Where do they go? And what can we do about it? What can the UN do about it? What can the NGOs do about it?
You know, it's I don't want to gang.
Maybe I just.
I'm one of the good guys.
I do want to say that Germany really fights our battles in the Council. So even though I think that's important to note also. But just on women, as you know, there is now a special representative on sexual violence and conflict called Margot Wallström, who is actually supposed to do what I'm doing for children in armed conflict for this particular issue. So there is, at least the Council has recognized somebody to do that. But the Council is also at this particular point in history very concerned member states are getting very concerned that they're going to appear in these children and armed women reports, when they're not on the agenda of the Council. So there are, for example, she mentioned India or Thailand or whatever, that we will mention in our reports countries that are not on the agenda of the Council. So this is at the moment the battle we're having, because many countries are pushing back saying, you can report, but you just report on countries that are on the agenda of the Council.
Can you explain, Radhika, what that means to be on the agenda of the Council?
Well, Security Council has, the Council when it meets, puts certain situations on its agenda, like DRC or Somalia. These are countries. They're on the agenda of the main Council. So what countries are saying is, you stick to those countries. Don't use this as a way in which other situations can be brought before the Council. Now, we in the children's agenda have been able to say that we have also situations on the agenda of the Council as well as other situations of concern. We have something called Annex 2, which are countries that are not on the agenda. That includes the Philippines in the MILF, that includes Sri Lanka, it includes Colombia. So we have expanded. This has alarmed countries. So now with regard to the women's mandate, they have limited it to only on the agenda of the Council.
Oh, I see. They are learning their lesson.
Yeah. So there's a little bit of a pushback by countries that suddenly say, if we have a little armed conflict in the hills, we're going to now appear before the Security Council, and they're getting nervous. So this is the present battle we're fighting, to say, no, we will report on any situation of concern that has humanitarian consequences for children. This is the argument that we're making, and we will continue to make. But there is pushback from countries. And they managed with the women's agenda to keep it, the listing at least. The body of the report can talk about anything, but they can only list parties on the agenda of the Council.
Okay. What are the obstacles that you meet, Ralph, or you meet as the special representative in convincing countries to ratify the protocol?
Well, first we must really acknowledge the work done by NGOs in this, on this whole issue of the protocol. Initially, I think, Joe, please correct me if I'm wrong, it is so-called friends who are the biggest people who objected, which is the US, UK, and all the countries that were ruled by the British Empire, because, as you know, they entered into Sandhurst or West Point at 16, 17, so they have cadets. So they were initially opposed to this 18-year-old rule. Am I mistaken? And so there was a battle was really with them saying 18. So finally the formulation was that children can be recruited in the sense they can go to cadet schools, etc., but they can't be put in hostilities till they're 18. So that was the compromise formula. So that now is the rule. But we're still pushing for straight 18, and Netherlands recently accepted, more and more countries are accepting straight 18. But with regard to most countries, but we are now have 100, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's 142, 42 or 43 that have now ratified the convention. That's a large number. And the ones who are left are mainly these island states, in the Pacific. And they say, we don't have an army. This is a huge bureaucratic thing to report to the Council. This is what they say. They say, we have 9 people in the Foreign Ministry, and we don't have time to report to the Council. We don't have an army. Why should we sign this thing?
They have a point.
They have a point. And then we say, no, but if everybody signs, there's a moral consensus. International, the whole world has signed, then you can say this is customary international law. Everybody has signed. That, so we want for the moral consensus.
Has the US signed it?
Yes, they have signed. They have not signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but they've signed the
protocol.
Whether one can sign a protocol without signing.
How can you do that?
That sounds interesting, but anyway, they've done it.
Well, it was really interesting because in the final stages of the negotiations, the U.S., as the SRSG said, they were one of the biggest obstacles to getting the protocol because they had this long tradition of recruiting under 18s as volunteers and sending them off into combat. And then finally, at the very last minute, they did a review at the level of the Joint chiefs of staff and decided no, they could actually go along with this. They didn't want to be on the outside on an issue like child soldiers. It would look really bad for the U.S. to be, outside. But then they decided, once they decided that they could be on board, then they really wanted to sign. And so they came forward and they asked specifically if the language of the protocol could be altered to allow not only parties but signatories to the Convention on the Rights of the Child to join on. And that was a departure, because usually it's just if you're a state party to the core convention. So it was really an exception made for the United States.
But they're signatories, but they have not ratified, right?
They have not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child itself. But one thing about the U.S. is once, even though it was an early opponent, once it came on board, it's actually taken some real important leadership. Not only did it ratify the optional protocol and change its own deployment practices, but a couple of years ago, Congress also enacted some pretty groundbreaking legislation that prohibits military assistance to governments that use child soldiers or support militia groups that use child soldiers. And in October, President Obama announced that he was withholding $2.7 million in foreign military financing from the DRC because they had not met certain criteria in ending their use of child soldiers. And actually that's something that we haven't talked about is, what individual member states can do to make these norms really more meaningful. And that's one example, is for individual member states to cut off military assistance if governments persist in using child soldiers.
And in November, we got notice that the DRC government had now formed a committee to sign Right and Action Plan. So that money obviously mattered to them.
So you see, what I hear, in a way, is that if the Council has the political will to work on an issue, it is incredibly creative. It finds the ways to find the pressure points, because on the case of child soldiers, even though, Grace, I do understand your frustration, you have no idea what has been achieved by the Council on this issue. Because I remember when I was at the UN, I remember the Graça Machel report and how you came, Otono, and you came, and all the protocols and the resolutions, adding the shaming and the blaming. This is an extraordinary, and you are right, that you build incrementally in the Security Council, and little by little you create a norm. Because I think on child soldiers, there has been a norm created. As you say, nobody can now be in favor of child soldiers. But this is huge. You don't realize the amount of work and of commitment of some delegations to do something like this. And I think the Council, by the way, was surprised to have agreed to it. And maybe, as you said, now is saying, oh, we're not going to agree again to that nonsense for something else, right? Because they do realize what it means. But it's quite extraordinary to see this. In a way, it's a message of hope that if the Council really wants to work on something, you see, it finds ways and means. It finds the tools. And I cannot really help saying that political will is not there for the women yet. Yes, there have been, especially, so you see the increment, the increments coming up. But, I remember only 5 years ago how the Council could not even pronounce the word of rape. Because it was either a cultural issue, or it was that, it was this. And I could not believe when I took students to the meeting on Haiti at some point, just after the earthquake. And all the Council was talking about was about not the reconstruction of Haiti, it was talking about the rape of women in the camps. And I thought, what is happening here? And Clinton was there, and Hillary Clinton had been pushing the resolution on women. There was a change of something happening. So I really don't know if in 5 years we can have another meeting like this and we can say, you see, it has also happened on the issue of women. I think this is an extraordinary example of what the Council can do when it wants to do something. But it will be ballroom dancing, 2 steps forward and 1 step backward, and if you do too much, then it backfires, and that's what you were really trying to explain before. What can the Council do? What more can the Council do, in your view, for the issue of children and armed conflict?
I think the threat of sanction is essential. I mean, in a certain way, this mechanism is working because we cleverly use the sanctions possibility of the Security Council and slice it in very thin slices. There have been very few sanctions since the mechanism came into being, but a lot of effects on the ground. The leverage is very good. But of course, you need a credible threat of sanctions. So I think what we have to do, and what we're trying to do, is the technical terms to mainstream this into the UN activity. You know, you have to go to the Sanctions Committee of the Security Council and say, do you have children language in your mandate? If you don't have it, then we will put it there. We did that for Somalia, for example, so that now the expert group on the Somali Sanctions Committee has also the mandate to look at the particular issue of children-armed conflict. They will come up with more information, which we add to the information we have. And at the end of the day, we may see sanctions also in this country context. So that's one thing. Sanctions is one thing. And the other thing is that we have to, you know, the Security Council is not just setting norms. He's doing that. He likes to do that all the time, but they have to be implemented, of course. And I mean, you need all the apparatus, the UN apparatus behind. That costs money. And we have to make sure that we do not go ahead, that we do not create too much norms, and the UN we have to strengthen UNICEF to do reintegration as well. We have to strengthen the child protection advisors in peacekeeping missions. We have to mandate them that they have the mandate to go out and look for children, or for women and children. And we have to do a permanent motor activity as a Security Council to get this measure through. And I think in the future we will have to be more innovative when it comes to what can we do to put pressure on these peoples, or these perpetrators which have been on the list, where you can't really impose sanctions. Because the reality also is certain situations are simply off the grid. There is no sanctions committee in the Security Council, so you can't really threaten them with sanctions. So what can we do there? What is the pressure point which we can use? And there we have to be more innovative and come up with some ideas together with the NGOs. What can we do to address these people? Because again, I don't want to be too technical, but I mean the huge thing which we're looking here is that we're having a mechanism which is going to these asymmetrical situations where you had norms somewhere floating around in the international air before, but they didn't count for anything in the Eastern Congo. Now, for the first time, you have a situation where somebody's going there and telling these people you get named and shamed. And it's a beginning, but it's something which has never happened before. And I think we have to continue that and acknowledge that this is really... We try to make international humanitarian law stick also in the darkest corners of some forgotten conflicts, and that is something which the Security Council must continue, and that's something which is really very, very, very new. And I think that's where we must go on and be more innovative, also in situations where for some boring technical reasons we cannot impose sanctions. We have to be more innovative and come up with solutions where we can tell these people, listen, if you don't change your behavior, we don't want to punish you, but we want you to change your behavior. Stop your practice, then you get off the list. That's something with the message which we have to get across more strongly, I think.
Yeah.
And if I can say one thing, I was just reading an article by someone who was looking at all this, and, under traditional human rights law, non-state actors don't have obligations. And what they're saying is that what's interesting about this whole Security Council process is that it recognizes for the first time the kind of human rights obligations of non-state actors, and is calling them to that. The action plan then is, in a way, putting down obligations of non-state actors. And in that sense, it's an innovative move forward. And it's strengthening that call by many groups asking for non-state actors to also be held to human rights standards. So that's a very interesting part of this development.
Because we always say that there are new actors, apart from governments and states and so on, but they play all kind of roles, and therefore they should also be accountable when something like that happens. But we don't have really the tools, we don't have the way to do it, because it's so new. It's really a post-Cold War type of problem, really, essentially. I would like to open the floor to questions. You have wonderful speakers here. You can take advantage of them. So please, I think Giancarlo has the microphone. Please raise your hand introduce yourself, and may I ask you to ask short questions. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Gary. Thank you all so much for raising awareness on such an important issue. I had a question practically about the relationship between nonprofit groups like Human Rights Watch and the UN body, when, from gathering data and disseminating it. I know you both mentioned independent reports, up until the rehabilitation process. Practically, what is the relationship there on the issue of children in armed conflicts?
Shall we take 3 questions? And if you want to say whom you are asking the question to, it will help us.
Oh, yes. I would love to ask Radhika and Joe. Sorry for the first name basis.
No, that's fine.
Okay, we have a question here.
Hi, I'm Alejandra. My question is to Radhika. It's a sort of a follow-up to Gary's question. I was just wondering how this issue comes up not only in the Security Council but also in the Peace Building Commission. How does if the Peace Building Commission also has a naming and shaming tool, and if it's as respected within the UN system, and also the relationship with the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council.
Okay, shall we take a 3rd question on this side, maybe? Yeah.
Good evening. My name is Gorgia Dama. I say this question's for Grace. Grace, the incidents of the female child soldier, particularly the prevalence of the child soldier, female child soldier, how do you feel the female child soldier, the girl child soldier, has been treated by the international community? And by that I mean by the International Criminal Courts, from the point of view as a female child soldier being a witness. How do you feel that we have treated the female child soldier? Thank you very much.
Shall we start with that last question and then go back?
The child soldiers, the girl child soldiers, again, I'm going to give the gratitude where it belongs. Mrs. Kromosome has really done a lot to bring awareness about the female or the girl child soldiers. But still, even at the ICC, when they're talking about child soldiers, the use of children in armed conflict, they're talking about them in general. They're not really speaking specific about girl child soldiers. So at the end, even the girls tend to disappear in these issues. But recently, Mrs. Kumaraswamy actually presented at the ICC, right, about the girl child soldiers, how they're affected. And I would love to see them be the witness, but also be protected, considering the fact that sexual violence is a sensitive issue. And if when the child soldiers or the girl child soldiers agree to testify, how they are going to be stigmatized in their own communities. Even before they go to testify, they're already stigmatized. They're already rejected. They're already in a very disadvantaged position. But if they do get to testify, they need really a special protection, because it's not just about testifying, but also they are stigmatized in their own community. But I really would love to see the perpetrators of this sexual violence be brought to justice, because it's a crime against humanity. It's not just afterthought or after the spoils of the war. It's a meditated actions that is directed towards the girls and the women in general.
No, yes, just the ICC, basically what our office did was we filed amicus curiae to argue that that when in the definition of enlisting and recruiting that they have, that they should include girls who are also associated with the armed group, because girls play multiple roles. There's at one moment they're combatants, next moment they're wives, they're domestic aides, and that to recognize that specific kind of role that the girls play, and to recognize them as those who have been enlisted or conscripted and should therefore get the benefit of the justice provided by the ICC and the reparations. So that was the amicus curiae we filed. And the judgment should come out, I think, in about a month's time. No, they're hoping soon, yes. With regard to the first question about the NGOs and the United Nations, well, we work very close. The UN, I think, on many of these issues, the engine that drives it is really the NGO community. I mean, I think we have to be honest about that. The kind of the ideas that when they first come out, and the engine that kind of drives it, are the community of civil society that's interested in this issue. So I think if a UN special representative or agency does not have a good relationship with the NGOs, they lose the pulse, So I think I have tried my best to have good relations with the NGOs. We have a NGO advisory board that meets regularly. And not only have they helped us in monitoring and reporting, for example, they give us information, and then, as she says, because some member states are skeptical about NGOs, if we come to the council with only NGO information, they would then begin an assault. So we have asked that everything be UN verified. But at least we get that information, then we can write to the country team and say, well, we've heard this, can you please verify? Sometimes they don't, but sometimes they do. But we take their information very seriously. But as important as in collecting the information is that UNICEF, which is our programmatic partner on the ground, does a lot of its programs on reintegration through NGOs. World Vision, Save the Children are the actual NGOs that implement the UNICEF programs on child reintegration in the ground. So there's a very close relationship between NGOs and the UN system. With regard to the Peace Building Commission, of course, it's a fund for programs, so it's not really going to do naming and shaming. But they have the present head of the Peace Building Commission is very sensitive to the issue of child soldiers and reintegration. And in the Central African Republic, for example, they've given a large grant for the reintegration of child soldiers. So they are helping us with the funding. My mandate comes primarily, even though we talked a lot about the Security Council, it is a General Assembly mandate. So I report every year to the General Assembly, and I also report to the Human Rights Council. What we've done in the Human Rights Council is focus on some other issues, such as children who are internally displaced, their rights and duties of the state toward them, as well as children that are in the justice system. As you know, one of the big issues now is, especially in the changing nature of warfare, a lot of children are being detained. And they come before justice systems as perpetrators, not only as victims, but you're having situations where children are being tried for crimes. And so we've been trying to work on that issue, saying we don't want to go through the punitive model, that they should move toward more restorative justice and other things, and fight against the penalizing in that very harsh way of children that may have committed crimes in warfare.
Joe, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, just to add to the question about the relationship between NGOs and the UN, it's so hard to generalize because the universe of NGOs is so diverse. And there's so many different kinds of NGOs. For Human Rights Watch, we're primarily a documentation and advocacy organization. We go out into the field, we investigate, we report on violations, and then we use that information to, pressure folks like our colleagues, the SRSG and Rolf here, to do something. But then there are a lot of operational agencies that are actually running programs on the ground, who are, running demobilization and rehabilitation centers for former child soldiers. And, sometimes they're in a different position because their staff may be more vulnerable to reprisals if they, speak out on controversial issues. So, I think there's sometimes a different relationship between the advocacy groups and the humanitarian groups. But, we often come together as well. Today, a group of 12 organizations wrote a letter to Ban Ki-moon about the future of the SRSG's office and how important we think it is to maintain a very strong office going into the future. And I think one aspect too is, it's a two-way street. We provide information to the UN. This afternoon we sent a 60-page submission to the SRSG of information that Human Rights Watch documented last year on violations against children as input for the next Secretary General's report. But then there are other times when UN agencies or UN offices call us and they say, we have concerns about this issue and for political reasons we can't speak out, but you can. Can you say something about this? And so it's a symbiotic relationship. We need each other to get the work done.
But you really see the good cop, bad cop kind of game here, because very often the UN, being a political organization, cannot do some of the things it would cannot say some of the things it would like to say, because it has to really keep its relationship with the member state. NGO can. If you look at some of the major decisions which have been taken on landmine or on ICC was pushed by the NGOs. I remember Kofi Annan tried to push it from the inside, and he realized that he could not. It had to be done by somebody from the outside of the UN. So it's really a kind of complementarity, of you can, I cannot, and, I'm good at this. It's comparative advantages and partnerships. And this is so important to understand about the UN, between the member states, between the NGOs, the Secretary General's office, to work together in our comparative advantages, to be able to establish the norms and implement the norms, which is infinitely more difficult for the UN, being this political organization. So that's a good example. Any question? More questions? We take 3 more. Yes.
Just a follow-up. My name is Mohammed. I'm a student at journalism school. Just follow up to what the comment that's just made. I agree there's that relationship sometimes a little bit weird, but what happens, like, for example, last year when the UN monitoring group on Somalia said something about what Eritrea was trying to do in Ethiopia, and then, of course, months later, other reports came out that said otherwise. So when is it a good time to act, and where do we get this information, or how do we approach when the NGOs are saying something else and then the UN monitoring group is saying otherwise?
Okay.
Hello, I'm Frida Yasin, and I'm with the Pan-African Network. My question is really about the regional entities, and I'm wondering, I haven't heard you say anything about that. Does the UN at all get any help from the regional entities such as the African Union or the European Union in lending kind of an extra arm to pressure any of these countries to stop some of these violations that are being committed?
We'll take a third question. There.
Hi, my name is Jessica Thomas, and I'm from NYU. And my question actually goes back to what was talked about with the non-state actors and talking about the naming and the shaming. When you think of what was mentioned, Al-Shabaab, who doesn't seem to really respond to the naming and shaming, doesn't really seem to be targeted for the sanctions. What's the hope for the people of Somalia, for the children who are suffering under, all these atrocities, really? What can the SRSG or what can the Security Council or other people or groups do in these situations?
That's a good question.
Okay. Let me just begin maybe describing the actual process of the information we get that goes into the report that the Security Council looks at in the case of children in armed conflict. Basically, the monitoring reporting mechanism, what is at the country level, there's something called a task force on children in armed conflict. And it is chaired by the highest UN official in the country. And it's made up of all the UN agencies that have any relationship with children, plus independent NGOs who the chair feels are impartial and neutral. And they are the basis of collecting the information for us. And the report that they give us is the basis. They send it to us, then we share it with our partners at headquarters, and then what happens is that if we get information like from Human Rights Watch sending us new things, then we send it back saying, will you look at these things, can you investigate these? If people object, we send it back, etc. So there's a process of writing it, but the core element is this task force. And it's chaired by the highest UN official, so he has to sign off on all the material there that he can stand by it. So that's the information that we get, that we use in our reports. The second question with regard to regional organizations, yes, we work closely with regional organizations. At the moment, we have 2 initiatives going, primarily where regional organizations have armies or peacekeepers. We're trying to get them to adopt child protection policy. So we have with NATO, for example, negotiations going on for NATO to adopt child protection policy. How to, one, ensure that in their bombings, etc., that children are protected, there's no civilian casualties. And secondly, if they run across children in their fighting, and what to do with them, etc. So we're trying to make them adopt a child protection policy. We're doing the same with the AU, and we work with AMISOM, for example, that is functioning in Somalia, trying to have the same kind of strategies with them. In addition, I must say this mandate was really, the strength of its support was actually the African Union and African countries. They remain sort of the core support for this mandate. So because of Grasa Machel, South Africa is also behind it, and we have a lot of African support, so that's why we can work quite easily. Asia is much more hesitant, but in Africa we have, especially with the AU, a good relationship. And finally, Al-Shabaab. Well, you know, I'll tell you quite honestly, we must also be honest. I would take any advice on what we can do to influence Al-Shabaab. I have absolutely no clue how to deal with them. And I'll just be honest in the sense that the naming and shaming doesn't work because they don't particularly care. Secondly, sanctions are not possible, maybe possible in some ways. In fact, Somalia Sanctions Committee has, to some extent, has adopted children, violations against children as a ground for establishing sanctions. So maybe we can try the sanctions, especially from the diaspora, etc. Maybe we can stop money and to have travel bans, but I don't somehow think it'll really make that difference. So if and that's the issue for, I think, the whole mandate, is that there are some groups that just don't accept the international norm. They claim that children can be fighters, and they flout the international community. In that situation, we don't have much room to work. Actually, we work best with groups that accept the norm, want legitimacy, want to be accepted. They're the ones against whom we have maximum impact. But those like the Lord's Resistance Army also, you know, we don't know how to really go ahead, and would welcome any ideas from civil society or academia on how to deal with them.
A good research project for SIPA. Right.
Yes, I think what I can add is, of course, the cooperation with the European Union, not because we are a European Union, but the European Union is basically having a sort of parallel structure to the one which we have in the UN. They take the information over, they have guidelines, they have their own reporting mechanism, and they try, of course, to sort of be helpful to the UN mechanism in using the information and the listing of countries in their own dialogue, in the bilateral relations and bilateral humanitarian aid. ECHO, for example, is by now, I think, the biggest humanitarian donor in the world, even bigger than USAID, I think. And of course, they have a lot of possibilities when they talk to countries and to parties to conflict to also take this issue on board. So on that side, we are quite active and try to sort of be as helpful as possible. African Union has been mentioned. AMISOM, of course, is a mandate which has been also mandated by the Security Council, and this is one of the mainstreaming parts which I mentioned. Yeah. Before anybody goes to Somalia as AMISOM, they have to have a mandate, and the mandate has to include language, as we call it, on protection of civilians, on the women issue and on the children issue. That's what we try to get in there. AMISOM is a special case, of course, because it's a hybrid. It's African Union in United Nations.
No.
So is it not? It's not.
That's Sudan.
That's Sudan.
AMISOM is 100% English.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then I'm wrong, and I retreat everything I've said before. But there's still a special case because they are in a very difficult situation, as we know right now. And I would agree that, and on Shabab, it's probably difficult. I mean, if you look at the comparable case, is Afghanistan and the Taliban. I mean, the Taliban, again, are not very impressible with naming and shaming. They don't travel, not very much, not at least to places where we go. They don't care about asset freeze because they move their assets in a different way. But they are, in a certain way, interested in having credibility, legitimacy, and they are, in a certain way, interested of not being seen as the entirely flouting international norms. We went to Afghanistan last year with working. Well, my ambassador went there as chair of the working group. We even met religious leaders, of course not the Taliban, but people of which we knew that they would have sort of channels of communication to the other side. And we tried to push a bit the angle of zones of tranquility, schools and hospitals, respect civilian objects. It's again humanitarian law, which we try to sort of implement there, and we got some echoes there. So I mean, you have people like Al-Shabaab or Taliban which do not react directly to naming and shaming, but they are sort of they know what's going on. They're very well informed, and they are not entirely enthusiastic about being always pinned into the same corner. So Al-Shabaab is probably indeed, and our Lord Resistance Army is probably a helpless case because they've been around for so long time. Al-Shabaab will probably also be a hopeless case because they don't really have, as far as I know, a very strong political agenda. On the Taliban side, I don't know, but at least you can try, and you keep to. I mean, by keeping the mechanism and the level of the norms, they are there, and they do not go away. And I think in the long term, they will prevail. That's my optimism, my personal optimism.
You raise a very important question.
But let me just say, with regard to the Taliban, actually, I think it's tied to their negotiations, where there is some movement on two issues. One, attacks on schools and hospitals has dropped very dramatically. And secondly, they have also come out with a statement that they don't recruit children, and it's the government that recruits children. And they kept saying that they put out a rule, but of course it's too young, that anyone who has facial hair should not be, it was interesting, should not be taken to fight or in the bedrooms of the commanders. So that's interesting because, as you know, there's a whole practice of bachabazi of these child dancing boys and boys that are there held by the commanders in Afghanistan. So they made a big point of having this rule and arguing. I'm not saying, I'm just saying that at least they're beginning to respond, feel like they have to defend themselves, saying that, which is a step ahead of Al-Shabaab, which doesn't even acknowledge.
Yeah. Okay. Grace, what do you think would make the LRA really?
Nothing.
What would be the point of pressure? You have been with them, you have met them. Do you think it's hopeless, or do you share the optimism that we have to keep trying and really at some point they are going to respond?
For the LRA, unfortunately, I'm going to agree with the...
Good.
I'm going to agree with him for the first time. The LRA issue is very... because we are... I think even when they came to peace talks, that was done in 2006, it was... some groups were trying to force an agenda towards the LRA. But they really don't have any agenda if you look at it. I remember when I was there, Joseph Kony, the leader of the LRA, would come and address us and say, we're going to take over Uganda. That's our mission. We're going to take over the government. And the next time he comes and says, the Holy Spirit had told me that go kill such and such amount of people. So it's just not something that you can negotiate or sanction or... That's why sometimes they have called them thieves, but they're not really thieves. They're advanced thieves that have caused suffering around East Africa countries. And I knew from the very beginning when the peace talk started that it was going to fail, because Joseph Kony is another person who he knows what he has done. He knows that he has really done a lot of atrocities, that even if he tries to accept these rules and come out, that he would be either crucified by the community itself, or he knows that he's going to go to the ICC. So Joseph Kony is, until he dies, I guess. The U.S. has attempted to send the soldiers to Uganda and to advise in Congo and Sudan, but I don't know how that is going to be successful, because they live in the bush. They live in places, they know the area that they live, and sending the U.S. soldiers as advisors, I don't know. It may make a difference, but I don't know what difference it's going to make, because from the very beginning, the U.S. had been training Ugandan soldiers to fight the LRA. It's not like they've been sitting down and they're not doing that. And how is it different from what they're going to do now? They say that they're not going to get involved directly, they're going to give advice. How is it different from what they were doing before by training Ugandan soldiers and also giving them advice on getting the LRA? It is difficult, but we keep trying with other groups that are responding. We keep trying with groups that want to clear their names. That doesn't mean that we do not have hope. But me, I'm praying for Joseph Kony to die, because that's the only way to rescue the children. I still have my best friend with the LRA up to today, so I'm hoping that he dies when she's still alive and she comes back.
Well, can I add something here? I think it's true. Persuasion is not going to work. Negotiation is not going to work. But those aren't the only tools. And the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for Joseph Kony and 2 of the other top leaders of the LRA. And Grace is talking about the challenges of apprehending them. I mean, those arrest warrants were issued years ago, and they're still at large. They're still operating, out in the bush. It's difficult to track them and to apprehend them. But there are any number of instances where Westerners who get abducted by pirates, but or who end up in hostage situations, operations are mounted to rescue those individuals. If Western countries or others had the political will to go after and pick up Joseph Kony and implement those arrest warrants, they could do it. It's not going to be. It wouldn't be easy, but I believe it could be done.
It could be done if the UN will accept to ratify something to allow other countries to enter in to pick up Kony, because they would say, "Oh, that's." You're infringing the sovereignty of the state sovereignty. So all goes to what the UN will come up with too, if they can allow Kony to be picked up. It's not difficult for Joseph Kony to be picked up, except that he knows the bush that he's in. He doesn't have that too much ammunition or technical hard gunship that can defeat everybody, except he knows the bush, and he also I would say we have allowed him to be at large, because if we didn't, sorry, I'm still going to blame my government, because my government would have done this before even it escalated, because they had gunship and they knew Uganda very much and they knew Sudan very much, but the government was so reluctant to bring this to halt until it escalated up to this point that the LRA have entered into Congo and then Sudan, and it's very hard to track them up. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think we have to stop our panel because we have the room till 8 o'clock. I really want to thank you for coming tonight. It meant a lot to me to be able to share all this with students. There is really, no matter how frustrated one can be when one has been through something like you have been through, Grace, I still believe that this is a message of hope. And I agree with you, that Ralph, that we have to look at the bottle half full, and we have to look at all the tools which have been put into place on the incredible work of the Office of the Special Representative of the Security Council to come to where we are now compared to where we were 10 years ago. So on this very positive note, I wish you a good reception. We have wine and cheese, and maybe you can talk more with our speakers. I want you to help me thank all the speakers who came tonight.